Hey guys, Arjun here. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today's video is going to be about the motherboard, uh, information about the motherboard, all the features on the motherboard, and how to know what motherboard you should purchase. So let's get right into it. To start off, we actually need to understand what a motherboard is. As explained in the last video, the motherboard is the main printed circuit board in a desktop computer. It is responsible for the communications of all the components, such as the processor, RAM, and all the other parts. Now, let's take a look at some of the parts that are actually on the motherboard. So, the first thing to notice is the CPU slot right here. This is called the CPU socket, and it's where the CPU actually fits in. You can see that there's this little handle on the side here. To insert the CPU, you have to bring this handle out, and the flap will immediately pop open. You then place the CPU in very gently, and then close the flap and insert the metal stick back into the socket. Then you'll have your CPU placed into the motherboard. So, again, this is where the CPU is going to be placed. Next up, you have the DIMM slots, DIMM, and this is where you're going to place your RAM or your memory. Older motherboards most of the time just have 2 slots, but nowadays almost all of them have 4 slots, and this allows for more temporary storage. You don't actually have to utilize all 4 slots. You don't even have to use 2, you can just use 1. But there's always the ability to utilize all 4, and this is obviously a lot better. To actually place the RAM sticks into the slots, you have to pull back this little lever right here, and then this inside here, it's going to open up a bit, and that's where you can push in your RAM sticks. Make sure that you're pushing in the RAM sticks the right way and they're not flipped around. Next up, I'm going to show you guys where the M.2 slots are. M.2 slots are where you're going to be placing your SSD or your storage. There are different type of M.2 slots. For example, there's smaller ones that are for Wi-Fi cards and other ones are for capture cards, but this specific one is called a PCIe 5.0 or 4.0, depends on what type your SSD is. So, when you buy your motherboard, you also have to look if you're going to have this black kind of casing on top of your SSD slot. This casing is called a heatsink. A heatsink is kind of like a cooling system for the component itself. Like for your CPU, we have to buy its cooling separately. It's going to be the cooling system, right? So the SSD, it also needs some sort of cooling, and that's why on newer motherboards, it has a heatsink. Older motherboards, it doesn't have a heatsink, but they have started to add heatsinks, and it's better for cooling and managing the temperatures of the computer. So, under the heatsink, what is it actually going to look like? Well, it's actually going to look like this kind of pin here. It is a little bit hard to see, but when you're actually placing in your SSD, it's going to be coming in at kind of like an angle. Let me show you in this picture. You can see that this is the SSD right here. The SSD is not flat in on the motherboard. It's actually a little bit at an angle, and that's for a reason. Then you can see that this is the heatsink on top over here. The heatsink will be on top of the SSD, and this will then press down the SSD flat to the motherboard, and the heatsink will also provide cooling for your SSD. Let's say you screw in your heatsink and your SSD. Let's take a look back at the big motherboard. You can see that there are multiple PCIe 5 slots. There's one up here and one down here. Which one should you use? Well, the one closest to your motherboard is probably the best one to use. It has the most bandwidth. However, you should also check with your motherboard manual to see which one is more superior to utilize. So why do motherboards actually give 2 PCIe slots? Well, the reason for this, let's say you have 2 SSDs. One of them has 1 TB of storage, the other one has 500 gigabytes of storage. It doesn't really matter. Well, let's say you want to use both. Then you can put the second one in this SSD slot right here, PCI slot right here, and the computer will be able to use both. And this gives more storage for your computer. By the way, the full name of these PCI slots are called PCI expansion slots. And the reason for this is because they kind of expand the capabilities that the computer has. Like you can add GPUs, Wi-Fi cards, capture cards, as I already said. So the next expansion slot that we're going to talk about is the GPU slot, which is right here. To place the GPU into the actual GPU slot, it's kind of the same process as the DIMM slots, but it is a little bit different. The GPU slots are called 16 times slots. They're also PCIe slots. But what a lot of people do is, if you take a look here on the motherboard, there's actually two 16 times PCIe slots. There's one right here and there's one right here. A common mistake is the people actually place the GPU into this second slot over here. The difference between these two is this one is a times 8 times PCI slot, and this one is a 16 times PCI slot. And that means if you place it in this second slot on the bottom here, you're actually going to get half of the performance as you would if you placed it up here. So that's one big thing to take note of. To actually place your GPU in, all you have to do is push this lever down, same as the DIMM slots over here, place the GPU in and let go of this lever. When the GPU is placed in, you actually will have to take apart a little bit of your case to actually make sure that the GPU is connected to your monitor. I'll show you guys how to do that in a later video when I'm explaining to you guys what the case is and how does it work. But for now, just understand that the first slot is the most important one to use. These next couple of parts I'm going to go through pretty quickly, so make sure to pay good attention. So the next part that I'm going to go through is these kind of circles on the side of the CPU here. These circles are called capacitors. And the use of capacitors, basically they're an electronic component and they store and release electrical charges to help stabilize the voltage. So they kind of regulate the voltage, kind of like how the PSU does, the power supply does, except they're specifically for the CPU and just the motherboard components. Now, if you take a look at the side of the CPU, you will also see that there are these big kind of containers around here. These are also heat sinks, and they are more commonly on newer motherboards because it's better for regulating the temperature. Older motherboards most of the time will not have these type of heat sinks. Next up, we have this kind of battery here. This battery is one of the most important parts on your motherboard. This is known as the CMOS battery, CMOS, and it's this circular battery that powers the CMOS chip. And this chip actually stores the BIOS information, BIOS. The BIOS information is the firmware that is responsible for booting up the computer. And this firmware, it manages how it exchanges the inputs and outputs, especially when you're starting up. When you first when you first open up your computer, you'll kind of see like spam F11 if you want to open up the BIOS. This is where you can go and actually change how the configuration settings of the BIOS look like. The next thing we're going to talk about is these I/O ports on the side of your motherboard. When you put your motherboard into your case and you're finally ready to boot up your computer, you're going to need a mouse, a keyboard, and if you have external Wi-Fi, you're going to need to plug all of those things in. So this is the need for the motherboard I/O ports. For example, if you have a USB mouse, you're going to plug it in here, a keyboard goes here, and a bunch of other peripherals you can put, like let's say your monitor. How are you going to connect your monitor? It has HDMI cables here. So make sure to check that your motherboard has all the sufficient and necessary I/O ports, like USB ports and Type-C ports if you need them and stuff like that. And the final part that I'm going to talk about is this ATX 24 pin here. This pin is actually the supply for the power. It's where the PSU, the power supply, actually directly connects to the motherboard, and this is where all the power for the CPU, the RAM sticks, the SSD, this is where all of the power comes from. You can also take a look at the top here. These are also ATX pins, but these are specifically for powering up your CPU, for providing the power to your CPU. So these are for your motherboard, and this is for your CPU. There are a lot of other parts to the motherboard, like the North Bridge and the South Bridge, and a bunch of other things, but I'm not going to get into those now as they're not really important. Of course, they are to actually understand what happens in the motherboard, but when building the PC, they are kind of just side things that you don't need to focus on. But now what I'm going to do is explain to you how should you pick out your motherboard and what motherboard is necessary to support the components that you have chosen. So the very first thing to look at is your CPU socket. So depending on whether your CPU is a AMD like Ryzen CPU or an Intel chip, you have to make sure that the socket matches your motherboard socket. There are a bunch of different sockets, so that's the first thing that you need to check, the CPU socket. The next thing is your computer case size. Like I said, I'll go into the computer case in another video, but there are three sizes of computer cases: ITX, ATX, and EATX. EATX being the largest. So, depending on your computer size, the motherboard size changes. For example, in the ITX, you're going to have a much smaller motherboard than you would have in the ATX case. So, that's the second thing to look out for. The case size. The next thing, this kind of goes along with your CPU, but you need to check what type of RAM sticks you have. Nowadays, there's a bunch of different types of RAM sticks, DDR4, DDR5. So you need to check the compatibility. If you buy DDR5 RAM sticks and you plug them into DDR4 sockets, you won't use up all the capabilities that your RAM sticks actually have. So make sure you also check what type of RAM sockets you have. The next thing I look for is a sufficient amount of fan headers. Fan headers are, you can see these four pins up here or these pins down here. These are for connecting your actual cooling. The cooling that goes on top of your CPU, it needs to connect to the motherboard also because it needs to be powered, right? So these headers are how you're going to power up your cooler. In my case, I have to use these pins over here, and I also have to use a bunch of these pins here. So make sure that you have a sufficient amount. And the couple final things I would suggest, they're not necessary, but two things: debug lights. Those are important because if some problem is going wrong, it can help you identify what actually is happening. This happened once or twice on my motherboard, and I could quickly figure out the solution. And the second thing I would suggest having is a BIOS flashback button. This is a new feature on new motherboards, and this is actually pretty helpful. It basically allows you to update the BIOS without having to actually enter the BIOS configuration settings. So you can just click the button, and it'll pretty much just update the BIOS for you automatically. And the last thing is just your preference of the brand. So I have an Asus motherboard, but MSI and stuff like other brands like those are also very reliable. Alright guys, that's going to be it for today's video. I'll see you in the next one where I'll go into depth about the CPU just like I did with the motherboard. See you then.